morning,
todas, bienvenidos a
everyone,
la
and
quinta
welcome
edición
to
del
the
Ciclo
fifth
de
edition
Conversaciones
of this round of
que hemos
conversations
denominado INTAL Talk.
that we have decided
En
to
este
call
ciclo,
INTAL
expertos
Talk.
internacionales nos traen su
International
mirada global
experts
sobre
will be
temas
providing
clave
their
vinculados
global
con la integración y el
overview on
comercio
key
para
issues related to
debatirlos en perspectiva
integration and
comparativa
trade in
con
order
las
to
oportunidades,
discuss them
desafíos,
compared to
implicancias
opportunities,
para América Latina
challenges, and
y el Caribe.
relevancies to Latin
Mi nombre es
America
Patricia
and the
Denuzzi, soy
Caribbean. I am
economista del
Patricia
Instituto para
Denuzzi.
la
I
Integración en
am an
América Latina y el
economist
Caribe
for
del Banco
the
Interamericano
Institute
de
for the
Desarrollo y voy a estar
Integration
moderando
of
este
Latin
primer
America and
conversatorio
the
del año.
Caribbean of the IDB, and I'll be
Durante
the
el año pasado,
moderator.
en ediciones anteriores
Last
de este
year, in
ciclo,
previous
hemos
editions of
debatido
this
sobre la integración
cycle, we've
regional y la
debated
transformación
on the
digital,
regional
sobre el rol del comercio
integration and
internacional en
digital
la seguridad
transformation,
alimentaria
the role of
mundial,
international
sobre la
trade
importancia
in
de la
global food
infraestructura para la
security, the
integración
relevance
regional
of
y
infrastructure
finalmente sobre la
for
inteligencia artificial
regional
y la demanda de
integration,
habilidades.
and finally
En esta
on
oportunidad vamos a
artificial
conversar
intelligence.
acerca de la
Right now,
relación
we'll be
entre el
talking
comercio
about
y
the
la
relation
sostenibilidad,
between trade and
una relación cada
sustainability,
vez más
a
significativa y
relation
estrecha
that is
que
more
plantea
and more
importantes desafíos para nuestra
meaningful
región.
and raises significant
Debatiremos
challenges
sobre
for
las
our
nuevas medidas
region.
ambientales
We will be
vinculadas
talking
al
about new
comercio, sobre la
environmental measures
deforestación
related
y
to
sus
trade
efectos
on
sobre la
deforestation
producción y el
and
medio
their
ambiente,
effects
y sobre las
on
implicancias para la
the
región en las
environment and
perspectivas globales.
implications for Latin America
Antes
and
de
global
cederle la palabra a
perspectives.
nuestra directora Ana Vasco,
Before giving the floor
permítanme
to our
recordarles
head,
que este
Ana
Intal Talk
Vasco,
cuenta con traducción simultánea a
let
través de los
me
canales de interpretación de
remind
idiomas
you that
habilitados
this
por la
talk
plataforma
has
Zoom.
simultaneous
Fíjense que tienen que estar
translation in
viendo
Zoom
abajo
channels.
un botoncito con
At
un
the
mapa móvil
bottom,
de
you should be
interpretación para
able to
cambiar el
find
idioma a
a
inglés o
little
español
word
según
that
lo
will allow
deseen.
you to change languages,
Asimismo,
English
también pueden
or
ir dejando
Spanish.
sus
Also,
consultas a
you
través del
can
chat de
drop
la
your
plataforma y las
questions through the
recogeremos para
platform
ser
chat
respondidas al final de
that
la
will
charla
be
en una
picked up
sesión de
to be
15
answered at
minutos
the end of the talk
reservada para
in a
ello.
15-minute
Entonces,
session.
dichos estos anuncios, es un
Having
placer
said
para
this,
mí
it is
presentar a
quite a
Ana
pleasure
Vasco,
for me to
directora del
introduce
INTAL,
Ana Vasco, the
institución
head
donde
of
trabaja
INTAL, an
desde hace
institution
20
where she
años
has been
liderando
working for
proyectos
20
vinculados con la
years
integración,
by leading
género,
projects
ambiente y
related
nuevas
to
tecnologías.
integration, gender,
Ana es
environment, and
economista y
new
licenciada en ciencia
technologies.
política por la
Anna
Universidad de
holds a
Buenos Aires,
degree in
Argentina,
economics and
y
political
máster
science
en
from the
integración
University of Buenos
económica
Aires,
regional
Argentina. She
de
holds
la
a
Universidad
master's degree
Nacional de
in
Andalucía
regional
de
economy
España
integration from
y
the
cuenta con un
International University of
posgrado en
Andalusia in
gestión de
Spain and a
negocios
postgraduate
internacionales de la
degree
Universidad de
in
Georgetown,
international
Estados
business
Unidos.
management from
Así que,
Georgetown
por favor, dicho
University in the
esto,
United
Ana,
States.
les cedo la
Having said
palabra para
this,
dar inicio a
Anna,
este
the
webinar.
floor is yours.
Bueno, gracias Patricia, muy buenos
Thank you,
días a todos, a
Patricia. Good
todas.
morning,
Muchísimas gracias por
everyone,
acompañarnos
and
en el día
thank
de hoy.
you
Quería en
for
primer lugar
being
agradecer
here
muy
today.
especialmente a
First, I'd like
Kimberly,
to
a
thank
Juliana y a
Kimberly,
Mauricio por
especially
su
also Juliana and
participación.
Mauricio
Sabemos que
for
tienen
being
agendas
here.
muy
We
apretadas, así
know
que les agradecemos muy
they're very
especialmente.
busy, so we'd like to thank
Como
them
mencionó Patricia, el
especially.
objetivo de este
As
encuentro
Patricia
tiene que ver
said,
con
the
tratar
goal
de
of this
analizar,
meeting
continuar
is to try
analizando
to
y
analyze and
reflexionando
continue
sobre la
analyzing and
vinculación
reflecting
entre
the
comercio y medio
relationship
ambiente.
between trade
Una
and the
vinculación
environment,
que es relativamente
a relation
compleja
that is
por las
quite
propias
complex
vicisitudes que está
given
teniendo el
the
comercio
turns
y
that
también por la
trade is
gran
having,
cantidad
and
de
also
efectos
given the
climáticos y también cada vez más
number of
intensos
climate
que estamos
effects that are so
observando en nuestra
intense
región.
and
Este tema
especially in
es
our
un tema
region.
central
This is a
también de la
key
estrategia
issue
institucional del
of
BID
the
que se
institutional
aprobó hace
strategy
muy
of
poco tiempo
IDB. This
y
was
que
recently
plantea tres
passed,
objetivos de desarrollo
and it raises
centrales.
three
Uno que tiene que
key
ver con la
goals.
disminución de
One
la
is to
pobreza
do
y la
with
desigualdad.
lowering
Un
poverty
segundo
and
objetivo
inequality.
que
A
se
second
asocia a la
objective
lucha
is to
contra el
do
cambio
with the
climático
fight
y un
against
tercer
climate
objetivo
change. And a
vinculado
third
con la
objective
promoción del
is related
crecimiento
to the
sostenible.
promotion of
Y este
sustainable
encuentro
growth.
también se enmarca dentro
This
de uno de
also
los
is
cinco
framed
ejes de
within
trabajo en
one of
INTAL
the five
que tiene que
axes
ver con
of
comercio y medio
INTAL's
ambiente,
work that has to
cómo
do with trade
podemos
and
promover
environment.
un
That is to say,
comercio,
how
una
we can
producción
promote
más
trade,
verde, más
production
amigable
that
con
is
el medio
greener,
ambiente
more
y
friendly
también
to the
cómo nos
environment, and
preparamos, sobre
also
todo desde el
how we
sector
can
público y las
prepare,
capacidades
especially from
estatales,
the
ante la gran
public
cantidad y cada vez
sector,
mayor cantidad de
given
disposiciones
the greater number
vinculadas con el medio
of
ambiente que
regulations
afectan
related
al
to
comercio.
environment
En
that
este
are
marco,
related to trade.
publicamos hace muy
In
pocos
this
días
framework,
nuestra revista
recently
insignia,
we've
nuestra revista
published
Integración y Comercio, la
Insignia,
número
our
49,
magazine
que
number
trató
49,
justamente sobre esta
and it
temática.
dealt
A
with
escritos
these
interesados
issues.
en este
And
tema
if
los
you're
invitamos
interested
a
in
hacer la
reading about
publicación,
this,
que ahí
we would
podrán
like to invite
encontrar
you to download our publication, where you will find several articles, some at regional level and some on cases and situations of countries such as the case of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico.
Como decía, es una dinámica compleja.
As I was saying, this is a complex dynamic, given the bidirectional relation between trade and environment. We are aware that environment can affect trade. We can see this when there's a drought or a flood, that this can damage crops and affect exports. We know also that trade can have positive impact in terms of the environment. For instance, when after a natural disaster, tariffs are reduced for certain imports that may contribute to the recovery of the affected area. And as Patricia said, we are well aware that there are more and more policies related to the environment that affect trade and vice versa. Until 1990, approximately 65% of trade agreements have some sort of regulation or measure regarding the environment. Today, and this as from the 90s, we can see that apparently 90% of trade agreements include this kind of regulation. Therefore, we believe that it is key to continue to reflect and debate on this issue that is so complex and yet so relevant for the present and future of the region. Before giving the floor back to Patricia, let me mention that there's a call for proposals for research for our edition number 50 that will be about the relation between infrastructure, physical and digital, for the integration of trade and the region. So if you're interested, do send us your details and apply. Having said this, I'd like to thank you again and hoping that we will have a great session today. Thank you, Ana, for your words. We are very proud to have such prestigious speakers this morning. Before moving on, please allow me to share what will be happening. First, Kimberly Closing, Senior Researcher at the Peterson Institute for International Economies, will be sharing about environmental trade regulations in central economies and their effects on developing economies. Next, we will be joined by Juliana Almeida, a senior specialist of the Climate Change Division of the IDB, who will present in 15 minutes its next publication on deforestation in the Great Chaco region and its implications for trade in Argentina. Thirdly, we will hear from Mauricio Mesquita Moreira, a consultant to the integration and trade sector of the IDB, who will have 15 minutes to talk about a study that is soon to be published on how to reconcile climate and trade objectives, minimizing the impact of trade on climate and maximizing gains from trade. Finally, at the end, we will have 15 minutes to focus on questions from the audience. Let's welcome the first speaker. I will introduce Kimberly Closing. Since September 2022. She has been a senior researcher at PIIE. She holds the Eric Zoll Chair in Tax Law and Policy at UCLA. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Affairs and associate research at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Kimberly, thank you for your participation. The floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation today. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all. I'm going to talk about climate and trade and the clean energy transformation, and hopefully you can see my slides. So the big objective in thinking about how to respond to climate change is the necessity of reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, which are on track to create quite a bit of climate change in the years ahead. One of the interesting facts about this problem is, of course, the concentration of emissions in just a few jurisdictions, about 20 jurisdictions, those listed on the right here, account for about 80% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at the top four, China, the United States, India, and the European Union, those four jurisdictions account for about half. And if you look on this list, you'll see a few other Western Hemisphere countries aside from the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Brazil are on the list, but many are not. And the rest of the world is important and affects climate change, but also is the primary recipient, shall we say, of climate damages. So one real concern here is that while the emissions are quite concentrated, the harms really spread throughout the world. So one question is, how are we doing at reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And if we turn to this next picture, you can see that temperatures have been rising both on land and in the ocean, and that fossil fuel emissions are at all-time highs, suggesting that there's a need to do more here. Now, there is some good news among the top emitters that I just showed you. China has been investing very heavily in the transformation and producing more and more clean energy. And both the United States and the European Union are kind of past peak emissions and have moved to a period of declining emissions. So it's certainly the case that emissions can be reduced, but more needs to be done here. So if you look at the key challenge, one of them is that global collective action is very difficult because this is a global problem. Any one country certainly can't solve it on their own, and they may have incentives to free ride on others' efforts, right? So you saw in the United States, there was very little action in this regard until recently with the Inflation Reduction Act. There was a lot more investment in clean energy than there had been previously, but there was limited sort of climate action in the years prior. One issue of getting the countries together and working jointly on this problem is, of course, the geopolitical tensions are quite high at present. You see frictions between China and the United States. You see war in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, separating countries into blocs there. And of course, the conflict in the Middle East is quite salient as well. So that makes this a difficult time for cooperation, even though we have really pressing needs for cooperation. Another issue to raise right away is the problem of equity here. The rich countries of the world have created this problem through their past greenhouse gas emissions, yet the brunt of the harm is going to fall on poorer, lower and middle income countries. So that creates concern about distributional effects worldwide. And the UN process through the Paris Agreement has suggested that there should be common responsibility, but differentiated so that poor and middle income countries have less sacrifice than richer countries. So that's another pressing need in this regard. The Paris Agreement has provided a really important moral framework for emissions reductions, but there's a consensus that countries' contributions towards this problem are insufficient to really tackle it, and better incentives are needed to get bigger climate action. And so that suggests trade perhaps as a role for providing some of those better incentives and for helping countries to align around an approach that can be effective in this regard. But there's going to be some wrinkles associated with that I will get to in just a minute. So first, some of the key issues here are presented on this slide. Of course, the first issue is that the market is going to overproduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is what we've seen so far. Without policy tools, you're going to end up with too much fossil fuel emissions. A second key problem is that the market is going to underinvest in transformative green technology, because the incentive of any entrepreneur to come up with new technologies and new learning, it isn't going to be sufficient to capture the great social benefits associated from moving down cost curves and innovation in new sectors such as carbon capture or sustainable aviation fuel as examples. So this suggests that we're going to need government intervention of both cost imposition types, like putting costs on polluters, but also of types to spur innovation and change. When countries adopt these policies, of course, though, they will also be affecting other countries. The more ambitious the climate policy, the better the effect for other jurisdictions. So the rest of the world should be excited when any country does something to reduce their emissions, and that's helpful. But there's also some potential competitiveness effects that are quite vexing in this area. When some countries subsidize and others tax, you can end up with industries worrying about their competitiveness in the global marketplace in a way that can inhibit good policies. So as an example, some countries subsidize clean energy a lot. You'll see in this graph, and this is for several years ago, that the United States has the biggest subsidies. And not all of China's subsidies are captured by this particular measure, but China also is a big subsidizer, as are European countries traditionally, and Canada and others. Right, but not every country can afford to subsidize clean energy. So you'll see that the top subsidizers are subsidizing a lot, but there's not a lot of action kind of further down the rank ordering of countries here in this particular picture. Some countries also impose costs on carbon emitters. And here you see a graph that shows on the vertical axis a carbon price in terms of US dollars per metric ton of emissions. And on the horizontal axis shows you the share of national emissions subject to the carbon price. So in the United States, for instance, which you'll see us in the lower left corner here, California has a carbon price, and a few other states have a very small one, but there's very little carbon pricing in the United States. In contrast, in Europe, you see many countries up and to the right, indicating both high coverage and a high carbon price. Uruguay, you'll see up and to the left, indicating a high carbon price, but just covering a small section of Uruguay's emissions. And then you see countries like Korea and Japan down and to the right, and South Africa, countries that have adopted carbon pricing with wide coverage, but so far at a pretty low price. Of course, there's always room to move up. When you have some countries subsidizing and others imposing costs, though, you do end up with some important trade implications to bear in mind. So imagine you're Canada or the European Union and you're imposing costs on your firms through carbon pricing. You would worry that you would then lose production of carbon intensive goods towards lower cost jurisdictions that aren't imposing those costs. Whereas imagine you're the United States and you're subsidizing your industries and lowering their energy prices, right? Then you will have an advantage relative to production abroad due to these subsidies. And we would expect the same for China. There's also the issue that clean energy and the transformation itself can become a vehicle for protectionist sentiment. We've seen that some in the United States, where local content provisions, for instance, have increased subsidies for those countries that have a free trade area with the United States, or that are in the United States, for companies that are already in the United States. And that tilts the playing field even more towards US production and away from production in the rest of the world. And so that can create important trade frictions. So if we turn to this next diagram, it sort of shows the spillovers that countries place on each other when they adopt different types of policies. So consider, for instance, country A that is imposing costs and has high ambitions. So we might think of a country like Germany there, right? They will benefit other countries in a couple of ways by reducing German emissions. There's less global emissions, which is helpful. And by imposing costs on their firms, if anything, they're increasing the competitiveness of firms abroad relative to German firms, because German firms have to pay these costs and other firms don't. Whereas if you compare country C, we might think like a country like the United States, they're pursuing an ambitious policy, which is good for the rest of the world. And we might think, well, that's nice to have fewer US emissions. It's also nice if new technologies are developed due to these subsidies that can eventually spill over to the rest of the world. But it does provide US firms with an unfair advantage relative to firms in other countries. Right, so some have suggested, well, we should make some sort of policy response to the fact that there are these spillovers. And you might imagine, for instance, Nobel Prize winning economist William Nordhaus had suggested that there might be room for a climate club where high ambition countries tariff low ambition countries to address this free riding problem. Of course, that's difficult to do that just based on ambition. One, you'd have to figure out how to measure it. Two, you'd have to figure out how to handle this common but differentiated responsibility. You wouldn't want to require a country like Mozambique to follow the same standards as a country like Germany, given that Mozambique has a much lower per capita income. And so, you know, there's going to be difficulties with implementing that concept, but the idea was to sort of encourage ambition through some sort of club-like mechanism. Another mechanism is a border adjustment, and the European Union, the UK, and Canada, among others, are interested in this concept. And the basic idea of a border adjustment is that you then impose on imports into Canada or imports into the United States the same carbon price that domestic firms are facing. Ideally, that would be done in a non-discriminatory way. And what that means is it would act sort of like a VAT, like when you sell a good in Canada, you pay the value-added tax, whether it's an imported good or whether it's a locally produced good. And similarly, you can imagine the carbon price would apply whether it's produced in Canada or whether it's imported to Canada. And that can address concerns about carbon leakage and industry competitiveness. Of course, there are also worries that this kind of border adjustment mechanism could hurt countries that are dependent on exporting to Europe. An example would be Mozambique, which sells aluminum to Europe. Europe right now is implementing this carbon border adjustment, and they're going to start with fees in 2026, but right now they're in a measurement phase. And they're just starting with 5 sectors: cement, electricity, fertilizers, aluminum, and iron and steel. And I believe hydrogen is in there as well. And so imagine you're Mozambique, you're sending aluminum to Europe. You might worry that your aluminum is then going to be subject to a tariff based on its carbon intensity. And so that's a concern for countries that are heavily dependent on exports to Europe. Now, we should point out, however, that Europe has designed this, excuse me, in a non-discriminatory fashion, which means that the European firms aren't getting an unfair advantage relative to the Mozambique firms. They're paying a carbon price, and then they're competing with Mozambique firms that are also paying a carbon price at the border. So one interesting question is kind of how comparative advantage evolves in this context. If you're a cleaner producer abroad, you may have an advantage in serving the European market, whereas if you're have more carbon intensity than average, you may have a disadvantage, right? So this creates interesting questions about how countries should respond to this carbon border adjustment mechanism. Should they, for instance, create their own carbon price? And so when we think about the dynamics here, one example is Turkey. Turkey has decided to respond to the European carbon border adjustment in part by adopting carbon pricing of their own. And when they do that, that converts the tariff revenue that Europe would have collected on the Turkish products into domestic revenue for Turkey. At the same time, they will get that revenue. They can increase their fiscal capacity that encourages domestic emissions reductions in Turkey, and helps them green their industry in a way that could help make them greener producers in the future. So you could imagine a scenario where countries start to join this kind of club-like carbon border adjustment mechanism by leveling carbon prices themselves in those key sectors. It wouldn't have to be economy-wide. It could even just be covering those 5 sectors. And that would have let them impose carbon border adjustments on others, and it could sort of lead to more policy alignment. Some countries have made such plans in addition to Turkey: Vietnam, Indonesia, Morocco, Thailand, Ukraine, Moldova, and others have announced that they're interested in carbon pricing in part in response to the carbon border adjustment. So this is kind of a promising dynamic, but there's some cautions to worry about. For instance, it wouldn't be fair to put in a discriminatory tariff. And some in the United States are interested in putting on a tariff on dirty production without imposing costs on the domestic industry. And if you did that, I think that would be quite unfair. You'd basically be saying to Mozambique, if you want to send aluminum to the United States, you have to pay for the carbon content, but we're not going to make domestic producers pay. So I think it's very important that this is done in a non-discriminatory way. I also think that it's important to adjust these kinds of policies to address the needs of low and middle income countries, recognizing this concept of common but differentiated responsibility. For instance, you could imagine just completely exempting the lowest income countries from the application of this regime. The entire bucket of kind of World Bank classified lowest income countries really only accounts for about 4% of world emissions, so the carbon impact would be relatively small. You might also imagine a tiered minimum price requirement that would turn off border adjustments at different levels. There was an IMF paper which had a nice suggestion of a $25, $50, and $75 thresholds that would be differentiated based on the level of development. In that example, if you were in the $25 bracket, you could then levy a carbon price in your domestic economy of $25, and that would turn off a $75 border fee elsewhere, and then as your economy grew, you might graduate into the $50 or $75 as your country became richer. Ideally, these mechanisms would be paired with climate finance and market access and trade liberalization in the green sector, and those can also fuel transformation in the energy sectors abroad. Certainly, I think any carbon border adjustment revenue could, to the extent that it's collected, could be devoted to climate finance, but of course, climate finance needs are much larger than projected revenues from this tool. And another important thing to do is to work to ensure technology transfer. I think this is probably the last slide. Yeah, I'll make this the last slide. What this shows you is IMF kind of projections of the emissions reductions that are required to meet different temperature goals. And you'll see that a 47% emissions reduction is required to keep the carbon emissions at the point that would imply a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures. And that's going to be very difficult to do. But you can get to 2 degrees with about a 21% emission reduction. But if you look at countries' nationally determined contributions or their pledges under the Paris Agreement, you'll see that we're not on track to even 2 degrees Celsius for big countries. And here they're showing you first kind of like a core 6, which is China, the US, India, the EU, Canada, and the UK. And then also looking at all of the G20. And if we just kind of go in the current path, we end up with about 14% emissions reductions, whereas we really need more than that. But if you put in a common carbon price floor with border adjustment mechanisms, you can get to 25 rather than 14 if you make that floor $50. If you differentiate it based on levels of development, which is something that I think would be quite wise to do, you can get almost equivalent emissions reductions according to the IMF modeling. So I think this is one thing that the world should be thinking about moving forward, are ways to make sure trade can be an enabler of emissions reductions, and that includes both things like the carbon border adjustment and carbon pricing, but it also includes pairing those kinds of measures with more assistance in the realm of green finance, but also with more trade on clean technology, new innovation, and foreign direct investment as well. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time.
Muchísimas gracias, Kimberly, por tu exposición y por respetar los
Thank you,
tiempos.
Kimberly, for your presentation.
A todos los espectadores por ir dejándonos sus
Thank you,
consultas.
Thank
everyone.
you so much, everyone, for
También ahí les vamos a
leaving
dejar
your
un link para
questions at
que
the
dejen
chat.
sus datos y
We
que
will
podamos
also
compartir
be
las
providing a link
presentaciones y la
so that
información
you can
de
get
este
all these
seminario.
presentations.
Vamos a pasar ahora a la exposición
And
de
now we'll
Juliana
move on
Almeida,
to
especialista
Juliana
principal de proyección de
Almeida.
cambio climático
She
del BID.
is
Juliana es
lead
profesora de enseñanza
specialist
de la
and
Escuela de Relaciones
teacher
Internacionales de la
at
Fundación Getúlio
the
Vargas.
Fundazao Getulio Vargas. She directs research in international development. She's an associate researcher at the Learning Center on Evaluation and Results for Brazil and Lusophone Africa for the same foundation at the Center for Applied Microeconomics. She will be sharing a publication on deforestation in the region of the Great Chaco area in Argentina and its implications for production in the region. Thank you so much, Juliana, for being here. You have the floor, and remember that you have 15 minutes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Patricia. And for your invitation, you can see my presentation. Is that right? Excellent. So as Patricia said, you will be able to hear firsthand the conclusions of this study that has not been published yet, and we are hoping it'll come out next week. The main reason was to check on the situation of deforestation in the Great Chaco, that is the second largest after Amazonia, and how this can impact trade. As you are very well aware, last year there was a call for all farming countries show that they are complying with certain environmental regulations, and that these products are not generating deforestation at the countries of origin. Yes, let me show you now some key findings of the study. First, you can see the evolution of the annual rate of loss of native forests in the Great Chaco in Argentina. After 1997, when the forest law was passed, you can see how this marks a peak, and then right after the pandemic, a low, and now a bit of a high in the amount of felled areas. Having done this study, the focus is on the provinces that are mostly affected by this: Chaco, Formosa, Salta, and Santiago del Estero, where there's the highest number of tree felling. You can see the evolution of this rate of loss of forest in these 4 provinces. To the right, you can see where these provinces are at the north of the country in Argentina. And you can see in the darker color where there's been the greater loss of native forests. And these 11 departments, provincial departments on the map, are about 42% of native forest loss, and it took place in 2011 and 2022. Now let's go to, let's say, the kind of forest. With the forest law, one of the most significant things was the category of these forests. So we have red, green, or yellow, depending on the value of conservation. Red and yellow have the highest conservation value. The law establishes that these forests cannot be felled. The green can. So this means that there is tree felling in forests that by law shouldn't be subject to tree falling, that you can see in red and in yellow. Of course, you can see that there's a breach in terms of what the forest law asks for. So what is happening? Why is there deforestation, and what is happening? So the biggest drivers of deforestation are cattle breeding, and agriculture. And we can see that there is an advance of the farming frontier, agricultural frontier, and that this can be marked in the Great Chaco area. You can see the main reasons here, and in pink is expansive cattle and agriculture. In blue is what we call silvopastoral, but we can join it to cattle breeding with maintenance of some rock coverage and cattle breeding that is traditional, and then fires. So those are the main drivers. But how is this developing? How much is the number of animals growing? So in this graph, we can see the result of the analysis for these 4 provinces. So basically the evolution of the number of heads of animals in these 4 provinces. And this has to do with cattle, mostly goat, sheep, pork, and horse. And that's where we add these 5 types of animals, where you can see 17% of increase between 2008 and 2021. Now, what is happening in terms of grain? And again, you can see the migration of crops to these 4 provinces, mainly corn, soy, wheat, and corn. So these are the greatest ones, the greatest crops. And these have experienced a growth of 334% of their surface, their cultivated surface lately. So this exponential growth is much higher than the growth rate at national level. So what happens? What does this represent in terms of impact in trade? So I would say that most of you must have heard about the EU regulation on deforestation, but this international trend is not only for Europe, right? As Anna has mentioned, it's related to trade. This is a trend that can be perceived in all areas and regions of the world, where we are also discussing this at Congress, and it's aligned to this. That is to say, to ask for exporting countries to prove that the products being exported do not originate in areas that were subject to tree felling, and regardless of whether it is or it is not abided by law. So even if laws authorize tree felling or deforestation, regardless of this, if this product is the result of deforestation, it cannot enter the European market. So this is a trend that we see that has grown immensely. So if you think, okay, so here we have this regulation that talks about these things, so countries will mainly have, okay, for instance, large farming countries such as Argentina and other countries of the Southern Cone, these products are encompassed in the legislations, leather, meat, and grain in general, and this will have an impact. In the case of Argentina, in the short term, we do not see a substantive impact because most part of the provinces and companies that must export to Europe are located at the Pampas region. This is for the short term. And in as much as we see that this migration goes to Greater Chaco, I mean the farming or cattle breeding more and more we will be seeing an increase of the risk. So this on the one hand. On the other hand, the exports target where it happens, where there is deforestation, the Greater Chaco region. They go to Asia. There is always, for instance, in a country, a target to increase the fan of commercial partners, the variety of commercial partners. So it is interesting to see that other markets, such as Europe and the United States, might be targeted. So you might see in these two graphs, basically, the main export destination of the Greater Chaco area. It's mostly Asia, as I said, China and countries of the Asian region. And as also to the development of export from 4 provinces that before didn't export until 2009, and now they can start, they have started to produce and to export significantly to foreign countries. So in the meantime, there will be a trade impact that will be quite large. Now, the study ends with recommendations. We verify the situation, the impact of trade, and also emissions. We can see here all encompassing the study. We analyze the implementation of the legal framework, that is the forest law. This is a very important framework, but also a framework that has not been implemented enough. There are, of course, opportunities for improvement. We've analyzed challenges in implementation. You can see some of these challenges, for instance, in terms of territorial management, criteria to establish this management by province. Sometimes there's a lack of update. They are matured, or they are just not following the forest law, as it happened with Chaco, not complying with several of the sections of the forest law, although they should have a participatory nature. There's problems of effective implementation, and also the situation where there has been created a national fund in order to take resources from nation to the provinces. And here we can see several challenges in terms of how this is implemented. First, truth be told, there has not been a full allocation of the budget yet in order to cover the national follow-up of this, and there's huge delays, even higher than 2 years in terms of accountability as well, in terms of provinces that receive these resources. So of course they need to say how they are using the resources, right? So thus in this study, point that I'd like to bring up, that is to do with the urgent need to have a traceability system that is solid and neutral in order to keep farming exports that are very important for stability of the country. The country is quite strong in terms of production, but we need to go from a traditional model to a more sustainable model. And many times what we say is, let's show practice through the numbers. If we say that Latin America, the Southern Cone, Argentina in particular, has farming sustainable production, we need to verify this and prove it with facts. And these numbers are not showing that we have sustainable production, and this is important so that markets calling for this proof of sustainability. And I'm getting to the end, but I also wanted to point out that the greenhouse effects, gas effects, for instance, this is true for Argentina and also for Latin America. There has been a spike of emissions, and this in the last few years is not only related to energy, but also in the case of Latin America, it has to do with deforestation. Deforestation today is the second case of emissions in Latin America. So we host over 50% of biodiversity at world level. So although we are not the greatest emitters, as we heard from Kimberly's presentation, it is not true when governments say we are not the main emitters in energy and transport. That's why we shouldn't pay the price of lowering our emissions. That is not true in the case of the energy and transport, because it may be not so, but yes, the use of the soil. So here is where we can find a greater contribution, a greater opportunity for Latin American countries to be able to contribute to the global agenda in case of the climate disaster that we are already foreseeing. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Muchas gracias, Juliana, por tu presentación.
Thank
Muy
you,
interesante
Juliana,
y
for your
oportuna la
presentation.
investigación.
Very
Estaremos
interesting and
atentos
timely. We look forward
pronta
to its
publicación para descargarla y
publication
leerla en
so that we
detalle.
can download it and read it.
Ahora sí, vamos a dar paso a nuestro
Now
último
we're going
expositor,
to
Mauricio
move on to
Moreira.
our last
Mauricio es
speaker,
consultor
Mauricio
senior
Mesquita
del sector de
Moreira.
integración y
He's the
comercio
senior
del BID.
consultant in the
Anteriormente
integration and
ocupó el
trade
cargo de
sector at
asesor
the
económico
IDB. He
sectorial
previously
en Perú.
held the
Es
position of
doctor en
sector
economía
economic
por el
advisor at
University
the
College
IDB.
de
He
Londres.
holds a PhD
Antes de
in
incorporarse
economics
al
from
banco,
University
ocupó un
College
cargo
London.
directivo en el
Prior to
Departamento de
joining the bank, he
Investigaciones
held a senior
del
position
BND
in
de
the Research
Brasil.
Department
Fue
of the
asesor
Brazilian
del
National
Ministerio
Bank
de
for
Hacienda de
Economic and
Brasil y
Social
enseñó en la
Development,
Universidad
was an
Federal de Río
advisor
de
to the
Janeiro.
Brazilian Ministry of Finance and taught at
Mauricio
the Federal
nos estará
University of Rio
contando
de
sobre cómo
Janeiro,
conciliar
Brazil.
los objetivos
He
de
will
las
be telling
políticas
us
para
about
afrontar
how
el
to
cambio climático y los objetivos de la política comercial.
join the objectives of
Mauricio estará exponiendo en
policy
inglés, de
for
lo cual
climate
si
change
quieren cambiar de
and
canal
the
de
objectives
interpretación,
of trade
pueden hacerlo
policy.
desde el
He
mapa
will be
mundi que
speaking
les
in
figura
English, so
abajo.
you can
Ahora
activate
sí, muchas
the
gracias, Mauricio, por estar
interpretation for that.
aquí. La audiencia
Now
es
we
tuya.
will give Mauricio the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Patricia. Let me put my screen. Oops. Can you guys see it? Hope so. Yeah,
Yes, we
so
can see it.
yeah, so good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. Congrats for my colleagues at panel. Very interesting presentation. So the idea here is to give you a sneak preview of this chapter we prepare for the forthcoming report on climate change and disasters that the bank's going to launch this year. We work on this chapter on climate change and trade. So I'm going to present briefly what are the main findings and the reasoning behind it. And I also add a couple of results of research we finished after submitting the chapter. So let me start with the motivation. So why should trade ministers be concerned about this relationship between trade and climate change? And I would say that there's two main trends of concerns. The first has to do with the fact that the trade policy as a climate policy has become very popular. You know, the number of measures, trade-related measures, trade-related climate measures reported to the WTO has skyrocketed in the last decade or so. So is it good? I mean, does it work really for environment? Does it affect trade? So there are important questions behind this trend. And the other important trend of concern is the fact that climate change and climate policies, even those that have nothing to do with trade, has a major impact on comparative advantages, particularly in the region. We just saw a number of disasters that disrupt production and shipping of goods. The one in Rio Grande do Sul was the latest one. And at the same time, you see those climate policies that, think of, for instance, the Paris Agreement, that just the commitments that the countries make to meet those targets, they have very important trade implications. And often they have, quite a bit of a protectionist flavor to it. So the issue is how to, deal with those policies, how to respond to those policies. So the quick questions that I wanted to answer in this chapter is, first is how trade policy can contribute to adaptation, and those two dimensions, adaptation to climate change. And the other one is to mitigate, the mitigation dimension of it, how trade policies can help mitigate its trade and overall carbon footprint. And finally, how countries in the region, the trade ministers can respond to those challenges that are coming from climate policies, particularly those that have this protectionist ban. So let me start with adaptations, which is I think it's the easiest case to make and to understand. The first point I want to make is how important is adaptation for the region. And no matter what type of model you look, those integrated assessment models that combine economics with climate science, what they show is the lack is one of the most exposed regions in the world in terms of damage to productivity infrastructure. Here's a chart, a graph showing the damage that rising temperatures are going to do to productivity around the world. This is from a paper from Cruz and Hansberg. And as you can see, the low latitude regions, which include most of the regions, are the ones that are going to suffer the most, the one in the dark colors. And the gains in productivity are going to be all up north. So you're going to be seeing production, particularly agricultural production, shifting towards north. So what about trade policy? What trade policy can do about that? So I think here it's pretty much a no-brainer. I mean, to the extent that you can speak of no-brainer these days. But the answer is quite simple. I mean, it's just keep the border open and keep tariffs low, keep trade barriers low. And why? Because trade clearly reduces the welfare cost of adaptation, at least for four main channels. I mean, it's allow for respecialization, and you can start sourcing foods from other countries if you have a hit on your productivity. Growth allows you to have more resources to pay for the adaptation. I mean, trade-related growth, and you can risk sharing, it gives more resilience because you can, diversify your sources. And finally, you can have access to adaptation technology. I mean, this is crucial. Heat-tolerant seeds and water-resilient infrastructure. This is all key for reducing the cost of adaptation. So I have no doubts that, the simple answer for trade policy in this dimension, it's just, keep the border open. On the other dimension, mitigation, the case is much more complicated, mainly because we know that trade, tends to increase economic activity. Economic activity, generate emissions, the so-called scale effects. There are other effects of trade that might reduce emissions, but in the end, what you usually see is a net positive impact on emissions. So what to do about that? So again, before I answer this question, we need to know how important, the trade carbon footprint, because otherwise, if it's not that important, what is the point of using trade policy to deal with that? So the first the first answer to this question is we look at the carbon footprint of the region, the trade-related carbon footprint in the region, and the answer is, yes, it's relevant, but it's not big enough to people believe or policymakers to believe that this is going to be a major panacea. The average share of overall emissions of trade-related emissions in all emissions is around 20%, Of course, these are the orange bars. Of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity across the region, but in average, what you could say is, it's important. But even if you shut down, trade, if you move towards autarky, you're gonna still have 80% of the problem. So yeah, so it's kind of a yes and no. I mean, yes, you should care, but you have to manage expectations. But because this is not alone is not going to solve the problem. So what about trade policy? And given that we already established that yes, there's something to be done there, what kind of things you can do? So I divided in two categories. I mean, those that are more related to multilateral preferential tools, and those that are mainly being used as unilateral tools. On the multilateral preferential side, I mean, the first thing to say is this: the best type of tools do you want to do? I mean, why? Because those tools allow you to minimize the risks of emission and competition leakages that Kimberly was talking about. If you look at the multilateral side, for instance, a WTO agreement on trade-related climate measures would actually go in that direction in terms of addressing climate change, and at the same time not generating a lot of distortions, either environmental or trade-related. Things like agreement on environmental goods could be another issue that you can deal multilaterally. On the preferential side, I mean, of course, it's not as good as if you address those multilaterally, but there are good tools to use there. They are becoming very popular. The use of environmental chapters in PTAs in the region. We have a number of examples. The NAFTA, the latest iteration of NAFTA, EU, Mercosur. So they all have tools to address this kind of externalities. That remains to be seen how effective they are. There are a couple of evidence out there, but it's something that we still have to see how effective they are. But it's a good way, sort of a second best way to address those issues. So moving to the unilateral actions, I mean, there are 4 types of measures. I start with the tariff reform. This is inspired by this finding of Shapiro's finding that most countries have, in their structural protection, subsidies to emissions. Why? Because they tend to protect, because of tariff escalation. They tend to have lower tariffs to intermediate goods, which are usually the goods that emit the most. So the thing to do there is to try to eliminate those bias or to raise the tariffs on intermediate goods, to the same level of the final clean goods, if you want, and see how this can help reducing trade-related emissions. We did this exercise for the region, and what we find is that at least half of the countries in the region, those that are on the left of the line, have a bias favoring trade in dirty goods. So the way to go would be to try to eliminate this bias. And the question is how much this would help in terms of reducing emissions. And I'll come back to this question later on. The other one, I mean, Kimberly already talked about, the so carbon border tariff. It's clearly a response to the fact that we don't have a global harmonized carbon tax, so this generate emission and competitive leakages. So you wanted to adjust that. So the logic is pretty strong. I mean, the evidence in terms of the relevance of those leakages, it's not that great. But I do think that it's a good way to go in this second best world, particularly because it focused on the carbon content of goods. Kimberly also talked about other alternatives, the so-called climate club alternative. But I don't think this is, would be a good way to go, mainly because, at least in the carbon tariff, you're focusing something real that you can measure. And the climate club, you're gonna adopt a tariff to non-members, which has nothing to do with the carbon content of good, will be immersive. And and I think that this is going to be sort of the last nail in the coffin of the world trade system, the WTO system. So I pretty much think that the carbon tariff is a good way to go. And again, there's this question. So do we need carbon tariffs in the region, either to stop our own emission and competitive leakages, or to respond, the actions being adopted abroad, and mainly, of course, to meet our climate goals, particularly those that were committed in the Paris Agreement. So this is where this is not in the chapter. This is a paper we recently published with a number of co-authors, Calendo, Fernando Parro, and others. It's available in NBR website. So what we try to do is to answer those questions. I mean, do tariff reform help in terms of reducing emissions, particularly using the net zero target as a metric? And also, do CBAMs or carbon tariffs help in terms of achieving those goals? So what we find very briefly is that tariff reform, which is the two first columns here, this is the impact on emissions, do practically nothing in terms of reducing emissions. So, I mean, you might have a boost trade, improve resource allocation, but in terms of reducing emission, it's clearly not very effective. In those other counterfactors, what we do first was to just apply a carbon tax and see how it goes. I mean, mostly to developing countries, and clearly the impact on emissions is significant. We use the latest estimate of the social cost of carbon, $163, and it do impact. There has an effective impact on emissions, but it's very far from carbon neutrality that those countries committed to. In the other counterfactor, we added the carbon tariff, the CBAM, to the carbon tax. And as you can see, there's not much change in terms of local emissions, and this is expected because the carbon adjustment is about the leakage to the rest, to the global emissions, not to the local emissions. And what we find also, and this is not shown here, is another set of results, is that it reduces leakages. The region has, if the region applies a carbon tax, there's going to be leakages in terms of around 10%. But this barely affects global emissions if we address those emissions, those emission leakages, and it has very negative effects on trade and welfare. So the question is, does it make sense to go, make all this effort to apply a carbon tariff if it's going to be costly, it's not going to help in any way your local targets in terms of emissions or the global targets in general? And finally, even in a scenario, this is a scenario where they're applying those targets alone, even in a scenario where the large economies are applying carbon tax and carbon tariffs, it doesn't make sense for the regions to do it because of the trade and welfare impacts. So I'm running out of time. So the third group of tariffs has to do with the regulations and the voluntary standards. Kimberly also talked about that. I think, again, here there's a large proliferation of those measures, more than 400 private voluntary standards. The public side is also, increasing very fast. We have most of those climate-related measures that were notified to the WTO SPS or TBT measures. I don't think that this should be a case for much concern on the trade side. That there's a lot of opposition in the region because they see this as a sort of a protectionist plot. I don't think that's the case. What the theory says is that there is this balance between, compliance and costs and benefits that you can get in terms of information and quality improvement. And the evidence that we have is that in most cases, a lot of the in-house work we've done is that the impact of those measures on trade are positive. So, I mean, doesn't make sense you just go for a position, and perhaps the better things to do is to focus on, trying to get common standards, to have a seat on the table to define, and the same case applies for the carbon tariffs. You want to have a seat on the table in terms of defining what type of methodology you're gonna use. And finally, the subsidies and the other, the local content restrictions and export restrictions, which are, pretty much prevalent. What to do about that? And the answer is kind of, the sort of answer that a two-handed economist will give. Yes, you should be worried about, because this has trade and growth impacts. I mean, we all know that the region has comparative advantage, coming from clean energy matrix and, this huge abundance of critical minerals. So this, it can hurt us, but at the same time, we should be happy, that these other countries are subsidizing our adaptation mitigation costs. So even if you believe that this is going to hurt more than it's going to benefit us, I think we should be more cautious in terms of retaliating or just replicating those measures for three good reasons. First, there's the survival instinct. I mean, we have no interest in delaying our mitigation and adaptation by raising prices of critical equipment and technology. I mean, just to believe that there are going to be long-term infant industry benefits to that. The second, we just can't compete on subsidies with the large economy treasuries. That's for sure, particularly given our fiscal constraints. And finally, we have a very checkered record in industrial policy. My time is already gone, so I'll end it here. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Mauricio. Bueno, ahora sí llegó el momento de atender las consultas del público. Estuvimos
Thank you,
recibiendo varias.
Mauricio. And it's time now
Les
to
pido a los
cover
expositores que tratemos de
questions
contestar brevemente.
from the
Voy a tratar de
audience.
hacer 2 preguntas a
Please
cada
be
uno.
brief in answering.
Empiezo
You will
con
each
2
get
preguntas para
2
Juliana, que sé
questions.
que se
So
tiene que ir
first,
pronto a otra
2
reunión y
for
no va a
Juliana that
opinar.
must
La primera
leave
dice,
soon. And the
entonces, según la
first says,
exposición, la UE no
according to
permitiría
your
ningún tipo de
exposition,
manejo
the
forestal
European
por
Union
considerar
wouldn't allow
deforestación.
any type
Y la
of
segunda dice,
tree
mencionó que en el
management
mediano
because you
y
would
largo plazo
consider
se
it
proyecta un impacto
deforestation.
comercial
And also you
creciente
mentioned that
si
there's
no
a
se
growth
implementa
for
un sistema de
impact
trazabilidad
if there's
confiable.
no
¿Qué pasos concretos
implementation
recomienda que las
of
provincias
a
del Gran Chaco
traceability system. What
puedan
are the
ejecutar
possibilities
para
for the
adaptarse a estas
greater Chaco
normativas y evitar
provinces to
posibles
adapt to
barreras
these
comerciales en el futuro?
regulations and
¿Qué acciones el banco
avoid
está implementando para fortalecer los sistemas de
trade
trazabilidad en los países de la región?
blocks in the
Okay,
future?
Juliana, sí.
acá estoy. Empiezo con la segunda.
So the second
O sea,
one,
mis recomendaciones,
my
obviamente, son
recommendation,
tres. O sea,
let's see,
la lista es grande de
the
cosas que
list
uno
is
necesita mejorar. Pero si yo
vast,
pudiera
but if I
recomendar,
could, I
priorizaría
would
3 cosas.
prioritize
Uno,
3 things.
fortalecer el sistema de
One, to
monitoreo del
strengthen the
cumplimiento de la ley de
monitoring
forest.
system of compliance with the
Fortalecer significa
forest
poner
law,
más
and
gente
this
y
means
tener
having more
infraestructura
people and have
para monitorear.
infrastructure for
Hoy tenemos
monitoring.
imágenes satelitales,
And now we
los
have
alertas
satellite
de
images,
deforestación por imágenes satelitales. Todo eso está
alerts,
disponible, pero necesita realmente utilizar toda esa información tecnológica que está disponible. Comprar
and information is
drones para que
available
puedan, no sé, básicamente equipar, porque
so that
sentimos que la gente que está
we
en el
feel
terreno, los
that
funcionarios
people on the
provinciales que
land,
están,
provincial
que tienen esa
officers
potestad o ese mandato
that
de
have
verificar el
the
cumplimiento,
verification of compliance mandate many times do not comply because they don't have the necessary infrastructure. So we've seen that there are fines and sometimes there's no impact really. And so even so, the tree felling is a criminal offense, a violation of this not in Argentina, there's a fine in Argentina. So my recommendation is that it is increased though, because now the value is it's really not discouraging. And above all, to have a traceability system is important in the province. And this means, and here is where I see that there needs to be joint work, environment and agriculture. And it's going to be quite hard that the import market trusts a traceability system in which the environmental sector, the Secretariat or Provincial Ministry of the Environment does not participate. So it is important to have a system in place. There are some initiatives, especially for the case of grain. So these initiatives that can replicate, and there is a lack of quick response from the public sector at provincial level as well, because it's going to be hard to have something robust at national level from the onset. So from the IDB, what are we doing? That's the second question. Let me see. Apart from working with the private sector to do the right investment or to reconcile production with conservation and working with some provincial agreements as well, and to finance the assembly of a traceability system, which of course has to do with updating IT systems so that there's a better communication of all the people involved and that these different systems are in touch, share information, and that it can be traced backwards what the goods, let's say, path was. So again, working with the public sector or with the private sector through training, etc., so that this more sustainability. And going back to the first question, many times we talk a lot about low carbon cattle breeding or farming. We say a lot of beautiful words, but truth be told, it is only sustainable what you can prove that causes the lowest possible income, not only in your own sector, but also other natural assets, such as water, for instance. So all this that the sector cannot reconcile will be hard for even us to have the necessary productivity and profitability to continue producing. I usually say that we need forests for there to be water, and we need water for there to be agriculture. So these practices must be reconciled. I wonder if I covered the questions. Thank you again for this opportunity. Thank you, Juliana. So please
Muchas
feel
gracias por
free
tu
to go,
participación.
and thank you so much for your
Continúo con dos
participation. I'll
preguntas.
continue with two
Para Kimberly,
questions for
la
Kimberly.
primera dice,
The
¿cómo
first
acreditan los países
says,
en vías de
how
desarrollo o en
do
desarrollo
developing
que han
countries or
disminuido las
developed
emisiones de
countries
efecto
show
de
that
gases
the
invernaderos
greenhouse
para que
gases
al
emissions
ingresar en
have
la
gone
Unión
down,
Europea
so
la
that when
aplicación de
they
los
enter the
impuestos
European
sea
Union, the
menor
application
o
of
nula?
taxes be
Esa es la
lower
primera
or
pregunta.
null? That is the
La
first
segunda
question.
dice, en su
The second
presentación
question says,
mencionó
in your
varios desafíos
presentation, you
clave
mentioned
para
several
la
key
reducción de las
challenges
emisiones
for the
globales,
reduction of global
como las
emissions.
tensiones geopolíticas y
So,
las
and
dificultades
also
para
you
lograr la acción
mentioned
colectiva.
difficulties in order to
¿Podrían
get to
profundizar en cómo
collective
se podrían
actions.
superar
Can we
estos
talk more
desafíos
about how
específicos
these
para
specific
mejorar la
challenges can be
cooperación internacional
overcome
en
so that there's
políticas
greater
climáticas?
international cooperation in climate
Kimberly,
policies?
tenés la palabra.
Kimberly, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That's very useful. I think the first question about measurement is really a key constraint in the carbon border adjustment space. What Europe is doing right now is suggesting default measurements that would occur if you don't report, but as a company or an exporter, you can report numbers that are different from that default. And so making sure that the administration of those measurements reflects the underlying greenhouse gas emissions in the exporting country, I think is a key challenge, and one that the European Union will have to work together with trading partners on to everyone's satisfaction. But there are mechanisms now where you don't end up with a default charge, but you can sort of prove out that you're cleaner, and that's the angle that I would try to push for clean economies. A second question about overcoming global collective action problems, I think, is a really key question. And one thing that I would point to with the final presentation is that I think if you look at carbon border adjustments or club-like mechanisms, there's two ways to look at it. One is you could sort of look, well, what does the modeling suggest this would mean for emissions reductions throughout the world? And I completely agree with the presenter that it doesn't seem to matter all that much. It's because leakage isn't that big, and the impact of the carbon tariff directly isn't that large. But one area where I think it might be useful to think further is how it affects the political economy, because one of the key problems here is indeed overcoming the collective action problem. So if you can create a rhetorical or moral or symbolic reason to join the club and to get countries to feel that joining the club is in their interests, and you can appeal to things that might be kind of small, converting the European tariff revenue into domestic revenue, might be just, pennies in a big bucket of dollars. It may not amount to all that much, but if it symbolically can motivate taking more aligned policy action, I think that political economy case is really interesting. One thing that we saw in the international tax space, and I had a final slide on this that I didn't get to, but I think it's quite relevant, is when countries were coordinating to try to create some minimum tax on the profits of the most profitable multinational companies in the world. One of the real difficulties in facilitating that coordination was concern that non-adopting countries could undermine the ultimate success of the agreement countries. And so that agreement never moved forward until they came up with a mechanism to handle that. And the mechanism was something called the undertax profit rule, which means now that even though the United States is not adopting, Europe can come in and or Korea or Brazil or any country that is adopting can come in and top up the US multinational companies' effective tax rate burdens. And so having an enforcement mechanism that basically says to the non-adopting countries, listen, you can't just free ride on all of our collective action. We're going to incentivize you to participate. I think that can be highly effective, and that's really caused that international tax agreement to move forward. So in this space, I think what you can do, hopefully with due sensitivity to the equity issues here, is use trade as sort of a political economy lever to say, like, listen, you can join and try to align with us in this emissions reduction effort. And if not, there's going to be some tariffs to pay. And even though those tariffs may not be all that substantial and amount to much, it might be able to motivate kind of more alignment and motivate carbon pricing in the countries that are putting on the tariff, because they don't have to worry about their companies complaining that they're being treated unfairly because they have to bear a burden that the importing firms don't have to bear because they're just getting the dirtier product without the carbon fee. So I do think there are ways in which this equilibrium can be improved by using trade as both a stick and a carrot, so to speak, like threatening the tariff, but also providing climate finance and revenues associated with the transition at the same time, and hopefully more free trade in clean goods. I mean, I think that would be my vision of how to kind of push the collaboration forward. But I do think you need special rules for the lowest income countries, and even differentiated responsibility in the middle as well. And that's a key component to that.
Excelente, muchas gracias, Kimberly.
Thank
Muy
you so much,
interesante.
Kimberly.
Bueno,
That
y
was
tengo
very
aquí dos preguntas
interesting.
para
And
Mauricio y con
finally,
esto
2 questions
cerramos.
for
La
Mauricio.
primera dice,
The
la
first
transición hacia la
says,
sostenibilidad habla de
transition for
abordar las cuestiones desde
sustainability
una
talks
perspectiva
about
multirégimen.
issues from
Como
a
ustedes saben, aquí en Brasil, a
multi-regime
pesar de que nos
aspect.
enfrentamos
In
a algunas
Brazil,
presiones
although we
externas,
confront
como
some
las
external
políticas exteriores
pressures
que
such
aborda el
as
comercio,
foreign
los representantes
policies that
políticos de
affect
agricultura
trade,
siempre van por otro camino.
farming
¿Cree que la
representatives
presión
usually choose a
externa
different
puede mitigar
pathway.
nuestro
Do you
problema
feel
interno?
that external pressure
Y
can
luego
mitigate
dice,
our
usted habló de
internal
3
problem?
canales de
And then you
transmisión entre
speak
el
of
comercio y
3
las emisiones de efecto
transmission
invernadero,
channels:
el efecto escala, el efecto
the
tecnología y el efecto
technology,
composición.
scale, and
¿Podría describirnos
composition
brevemente
effect.
cómo
Can you
actúan estos
briefly
canales y
describe
en este
how these
sentido,
channels work?
qué
And in this
capacidad tienen los
regard,
países de incidir en ellos
how
a través de políticas
much can
comerciales? Y luego
countries
relacionado con
play a
ello, ¿podrías
role
profundizar
in
en cómo
trade?
las
And
políticas
can you also
comerciales pueden
talk about
facilitar
how
la reespecialización
political
y el acceso a las tecnologías de adaptación en
policies
América
can
Latina y el Caribe?
affect implementation and adaptation in Latin America and the Caribbean?
Voy a seguir en inglés para mantener enfim,
All right.
para manter la consistencia. Just yeah, I mean, on the external pressure, I think it definitely helps. Particularly, I mean, more than anything, more than any trade-related measures. I mean, if you look at the Paris Agreement, which supposedly has nothing to do with trade, if you look at the commitments that countries have made, that the Brazil has made, if you do the numbers, I mean, there's no way you're going to meet those commitments either for 2030 or 2050 without taking actions at home. And this is go well beyond trade. That's the point that I was trying to make. I mean, without putting a carbon tax, either adjusting at the border or not, you're not going to meet those commitments. I mean, if you're really serious about 2030 or 2050, you do have to go for carbon tax. In the case of Brazil, you do need to improve your land use emissions. So yeah, I mean, I think the external pressure helps, but it's coming. I wouldn't say from the CBAN, the EU CBAN or other, possible schemes adopt elsewhere, but it's coming from the Paris Agreement, and it's coming from the fact that if you look at the projections of the IM models, I mean, Brazil is going to be one of the most affected countries in particularly agriculture. So even the agricultural producers should be worried about, doing something on this thing, and it has to do with imposing carbon tax and restricting deforestation. On the second question, yeah, I mean, this is Grossman-Kruger way of looking at this relationship between trade and emissions or environment in general. Scale has to do with the scale effect has to do with the fact that trade has a positive impact on growth, and if you're boosting economic activity, you're eventually going to emit more, and this is going to have a negative impact on or it's a positive impact on emissions. Emissions are going to increase, but it's negative for the environment. There's another side to it is that if you're growing, you're getting welfare, you might be demanding more environmental more regulations, and this might counterbalance the impact of more economic activity on emissions. Composition has to do with the fact that with trade, countries re-specialize, and they can either go to more dirty sectors or to cleaner sectors. This is pretty much an empirical question. We did look at the impact in the region in the last decades, and we didn't find a negative impact in terms of composition. I mean, in the sense that, the region is not specializing necessarily in more dirty goods because of trade. If you look at what happened, this is not something that comes out. The major negative impact in terms of increasing emission comes from the scale effect and not from the composition effect. And finally, the technologies has to do with the idea that trade, can boost productivity, so you can produce more with less emissions. You have, access to cleaner technology, both for mitigation and adaptation. Usually what you see, particularly in developed countries, that this kind of effect tends to dominate any composition effects. This idea that developed countries are moving dirty sectors to the developing world, you don't see this having a big impact, or at least this is more than outweighed by the fact that they're improving very much in terms of technology. So they managed to reduce emissions, not because they are specializing in cleaner sectors, but because they are becoming more efficient in terms of producing goods with less emission. I'll leave it there. Thank you.